All right, so I'm going to look at David Holmgren's ideas as expressed in the interview that I had you watch, and also Jack Spirko's ideas in the podcast, the Survival Podcast. David Holmgren is the co-founder of Permaculture, along with Bill Mollison. As I mentioned before, Holmgren is the younger of the two by quite a bit. Mollison passed a couple of years ago, but Holmgren is still going strong. And you saw a very good interview by him, I should say with him, from Happen Films, entitled David Holmgren Interview on Permaculture, Energy Descent, and Future Scenarios. He is the author of Permaculture, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, and most recently, a book called Retro Suburbia. There was a lot of good stuff in that interview, and actually a lot of hopeful stuff in that interview from Holmgren. But I thought I would zero in on one of the most interesting things that he talked about, which is the various energy descent scenarios. We tend to hear about these things, whether it's the end of our supply of fossil fuels, or on the other end of that, global warming and climate change in catastrophic terms that sound rather sudden. And so I think that in many people's imagination, if they are inclined to believe that this is going to become a huge problem at some point, they tend to think of it as a sort of cataclysmic event, a sudden and cataclysmic event looming out there in the future. And Holmgren, of course, he takes that apart. He's very practical about it. He's been studying it for years, and so he talks about the most likely scenario being energy descent, which is some decline in availability and or use of fossil fuels related to climate change that's going to affect our ability to continue to do things the way we do now, but it will not be some sort of sudden event, but probably a slower process, and one that we can therefore adapt to. So I thought that I would spend some time on this idea of energy descent scenarios. And he has a website, futurescenarios.org, where he has laid out the things that he mentioned very briefly in his interview of these various energy descent scenarios. He says it's most likely that we will experience energy descent instead of a sudden collapse, or what he calls a techno-explosion. Techno-explosion, I think, is a reference to the idea that we will ramp up our technological capabilities a la accelerationism and basically fix the problems and get out of the predicament. Or he says also it's more likely that we'll experience slow energy descent rather than techno-stability, which is where we use technology and come to terms with what we can do and then find a way to hold to a particular way of life and go no further. So he mentioned all of these energy descent scenarios in the interview, but the website does a lot more to flesh them out. And so I'm going to be quoting a lot from this website. There's 4 energy descent scenarios that he discusses: brown tech, green tech, Earth Steward, and lifeboats. What I've done in each case is taken the first paragraph of that's on the website for that category to kind of give you an idea, and then I will also go further than that and talk about some of the elaboration of these different scenarios within the particular website page. So the first scenario is brown tech, and he describes it as slow energy decline rates and severe climate change symptoms. In the interview, you may remember he talked about how we still have a lot of fossil fuels, but over time we go looking for them in more difficult places. We engage in extraction techniques that cost more not only in dollars but more costly to the environment, like fracking, for instance, to get oil and gas out of the earth. It's going to require more and more effort, and so this leads to, among other things, it becoming more expensive. We have kind of reached a peak in our fossil fuel usage, and it's pretty cheap right now, but people like Holmgren tend to think pretty soon it's going to become pretty expensive in a lot of ways. So slow energy decline rates, though, over probably decades, as the ability of that we have to extract these resources gets more and more difficult. But in this particular scenario, the climate change symptoms are severe. Now, these scenarios are basically guesses. So he's not saying that the slow energy decline produces severe climate change. He doesn't know which way climate change is going to go, whether it would be very severe or very mild. Nobody really knows exactly what's going to happen. So he's taking different scenarios and he's trying to figure out what would happen in each one. And he starts off saying the brown tech world is one in which the production of oil declines after a peak of 2005 to 2010, and of course we're beyond that now, at about 2% per annum, and the subsequent peak and decline of natural gas is also relatively gentle, but the severity of global warming symptoms is at the extreme end of current mainstream scientific predictions. In this scenario, strong, even aggressive national policies and actions prevail to address both the threats and the opportunities from energy peak and climatic change. The political system could be described as corporatist or fascist, which Mussolini described as a merger of state and corporate power. And I think that's a pretty good definition, the merger of state and corporate power. And you can see how corporatism could occur in this scenario, because you would need a strong government and strong cooperation with corporations to continue to create more means of obtaining the fossil fuels, the non-renewable resources from the earth in ways that are less efficient and more costly to major industries. And we know that when major industries have to continue to find new resources and put out more and more product, this can become too costly for them to make a profit. And this is one of the reasons why then government would step in support of corporations. He says the tendency in existing systems for massive centralized investment by corporations and governments give priority to getting more energy out of lower grade non-renewable resources like tar sands, coal, and uranium, and biofuels from industrial agriculture and forestry. This would be in an effort to keep energy costs low enough so that people could put gas in their tanks and so that everything could run and continue on without creating an economic crisis or shrinkage of the economy. And then on the climate change front, he says at the same time, the cost of defending and replacing urban infrastructure threatened by storms and future sea level rise consumes more resources, while droughts and chaotic seasonal changes reduce food production from broadacre and small-scale agriculture. So at any rate, I think the point here is that in this scenario, government and corporate power come together to create a sort of corporatism in order to try to maintain a stable economy, try to keep fuel costs down, try to avoid any sort of major economic, which leads to social disruption, try to deal with the effects created by this more severe climate change in this scenario that will require government to step in more and more to fix things, to supply people with what they need so that, again, you don't have basically societal collapse or, breakdown. Okay, so that doesn't sound too great. Okay, let's move on to the green tech scenario. He says this is the most benign. It It is characterized by slow energy decline rates and mild climate change symptoms. So the difference here is in, let's see what happens if the climate change symptoms are milder and take longer to develop. He says the green tech scenario is the most benign in that adverse climate changes are at the low end of projections. Oil and gas production declines slowly, as in the brown tech future. So the sense of chaos and crisis is more muted without major economic collapse or conflict. This allows resources to flow to a greater diversity of responses at the global, national, city, community, and personal level. In some already densely populated poor countries, conditions worsen. So in this scenario, you don't get this necessity for the increased combination of government and corporate power. It sounds like you're less likely to end up with some sort of fascist system or top-down system that's necessary to exert power to keep things from spinning out of control. So without the drastic climate change symptoms, in other words, people have more of a chance to adapt at many levels, to change the way that they do business. In the next paragraph, he says, however, higher commodity prices allow some poorer producer economies to escape their debt cycle, while programs to empower women result in rapid reduction in the birth rate in those countries, I assume. The gradual reduction in capacities of countries to project power globally due to rising energy cost increases national security and redirection of resources away from defense and resource capture to resource conservation and technological innovation. The consolidation of the global communication systems maintains global outlooks and understandings, if not global economics. He also says the principles behind organic agriculture and ecological management and resource allocation become the norm in many farming systems, helping to stabilize agriculture challenged by increasing costs of energy inputs and albeit mild climate change. All right, so you can see in his interview, I think that he oftentimes was assuming this scenario. You know, the change is going to be gradual, that people have a chance to adjust, that we ought to be thinking about that, but in a way that, the increasing costs of extracting fuels, either from the earth or from agriculture, and the climate change that occurs are going to more or less force people to adapt and come up with new ideas. And this is where the permaculture ideas can come in the handiness. But basically, permaculturalists like Mollison and Holmgren thought that they were and are supplying people with the solutions that they will need, kind of in a prototype form. Not that they can't change them and develop them in different ways, but supplying them with scenarios and plans that they could use as they make these adaptations. And in a lot of ways, this green tech scenario is treated by Holmgren as a sort of blessing in disguise, a sort of cure, a forced cure, you might say, for what ails us. Now, Mollison talks about Gaia and sort of almost personalizes the earth, as though the earth basically pushes back. That's kind of mystical thinking. Some people like it, some people don't. Holmgren stays away from that type of language, but he's basically talking about the same sort of reaction. The earth makes it harder for people to do what they want to do. The costs go up. The earth sort of makes it more costly over time as fossil fuels decline, and eventually people are forced to adapt, as they always have. People are capable of adapting, and now, as Holmgren says, we have all these things that have been produced by our excessive levels of production that can be used for hundreds of years to come, repurposed and recycled and reused, and we have a lot of knowledge that's been built up because of the explosion of technology and productivity. that, yeah, has produced many things that people don't need, and pollution and so on, but has also given us a knowledge base that we can use in this period of decline to smartly adapt, instead of, thinking of this as going back to, the life of the Pilgrims. I don't think that's what he envisions. Okay, so the next scenario is Earth Steward, bottom-up rebuild. This is the scenario in which we have rapid energy decline rates and mild climate change symptoms. Okay, so here the variable that's changed this time is the rapid decline rates. He says in this energy decline rates, he says in this scenario, the decline in oil production after a peak in total liquids production before 2010 is at the extreme end of authoritative predictions, and is followed by an even faster decline in gas production, plus a simultaneous peak in coal production. The shock to the world's fragile financial systems is overwhelming, resulting in severe economic depression and perhaps some further short, sharp resource wars. So with economic collapse occurring and political stresses, he says, as a result, there's a lot more likelihood of wars. I would assume both international wars and civil strife. But because climate change is not occurring as rapidly, there is still the possibility of adapting as far as the food supply goes. However, this is made hard because of the political and social disruption that would occur. For people to be able to organize would be difficult. He talks about shortages leading to rationing, black markets, and riots for food and energy. He says increases in crime, malnutrition, and disease leading to a rising death rate, accelerated in some countries by epidemics and pandemics that have a major impact on social and economic capacity. The collapse in the tax base available to national and state governments reduces their power, and even city-level restructuring of infrastructure is difficult, but local government retains some degree of effective services, decision-making, and possibly democracy. So you can see that this would benefit people who are capable of dealing with small-scale community, with social organization at the local level, of producing things, food and other things at the local level, not being dependent for production on biofuels and chemicals. He gets kind of futuristic in a cool way here. He says suburban landscapes around smaller cities and regional towns with greater social capital are transformed with a booming and relatively egalitarian society sustained by biointensive permaculture farming and retrofitting and reuse supported by resources from both the immediate rural hinterland and inner urban salvage. Well, there I think you have the idea of his book Retro Suburbia in kernel form. He does call himself a futurist. He understands that he's dealing with imaginative future scenarios and making proposals for how to deal with various energy decline scenarios. So it's not like he's saying this is going to happen, but he's like so many philosophers, they come up with ideas that may be useful in the future depending on which way we go. And that's the way I would take these kinds of predictions. The final descent scenario is called Lifeboats, Civilization Triage. And that doesn't sound too good. It's characterized by rapid energy decline rates and severe climate change symptoms. He says, in this scenario, supplies of high-quality fossil fuels decline rapidly, the economy fails, and human contributions to global warming collapse, but lag effects and positive feedbacks in the climate system continue to drive an acceleration of global warming. As of 2007, an increasing number of scientists believe it may already be too late to avoid catastrophic climate change. In the Lifeboat scenario, the adverse symptoms of the Brown Tech and Earth Steward scenarios combine to force a progressive collapse in most forms of economy and social organization. Local wars, including use of nuclear weapons, accelerate collapse in some areas, but the failure of national systems of power prevent global warfare. Successive waves of famine and disease break down social and economic capacity on a larger scale than the Black Death in medieval Europe, leading to a halving of global population in a few decades. I sort of liken this to the Noah's Ark way of thinking, because he proposes that there will be lifeboat communities. These are communities that can survive and can kind of retain the knowledge that they have and the practices that they have, which can hopefully rebuild and in effect create new civilization. He says at the end of this particular section of the website, if the knowledge of ecological processes and their creative manipulation using minimal resources are retained and developed in the lifeboat communities, then survival and resurgence of a more than minimalist culture may allow global human population to be sustained at perhaps half rather than 1/10 of current levels. More importantly, it may be possible to embed the wisdom of the lessons learned so that unconstrained human growth does not repeat such an intense cycle. Clearly, these last thoughts are highly speculative, but build from the same lineage of permaculture thinking developed over the last 30 years that informs the rest of the scenarios. So, I would encourage everybody to take a look at that website. There's a lot more there. I went over some of the bigger ideas involved in these scenarios, but there's a lot more to be seen here. And basically, although I don't believe he uses the term survivalist, Holmgren's way of thinking about permaculture, and maybe a large part of the permaculture movement itself, is survivalist in its orientation. Now, we normally think of survivalists, again, in the American context, the survivalists are the people who are hunkered down in compounds with many rounds of ammunition waiting for the government to come and break down the doors, and they're hoarding up MREs in their underground bunkers. So survivalism has gotten a little bit of a bad name, just like anarchism. However, how many of us are starting to talk about how we are going to survive? And how human beings are going to survive as we face big changes that will take place inevitably over the next few hundred years. Change is a constant in global history. And so whether it's from global warming or from political breakdown, from disease, various factors, some of which we can't even imagine, may take place. They have taken place in the past, and they've changed everything. This time, climate change may be caused by human actions, but we've had periods of climate change in the past. Some huge ones, some lesser ones. In each case, human beings have had to adapt. Many people have perished as well. The bubonic plague set people back in Europe, to the point where most people didn't know how to read and write. It also opened up changes moving forward that made for greater economic development and democratization. So I think that the bad name that has been given survivalists by the tendency for us to conjure in our heads this sort of stereotypical person is a bit unfair. And if we think instead in terms of people concerned about long-term survival and sustainability, it takes on a different ring, does it not? And so I think that's what Holmgren's trying to do. Sometimes these predictions sound very dire and hard to wrap our minds around, and hopefully many of them will not come to pass. But he believes that he is doing the responsible thing in trying to take the knowledge that he has about agriculture and deal with how it can continue, because after all, this is what keeps us alive, this is what feeds us. Have it continue regardless of the scenarios that we may face in the future. So we listened to a podcast by Scott Mann of the Permaculture podcast in an interview that he did with Jack Spirko of the Survival Podcast. Now, if you go to Spirko's site, thesurvivalpodcast.com, you'll see that it has a pretty different feel from the Permaculture podcast site or other permaculture sites that you might go on. Spirko doesn't have a problem with guns. He is more of a survivalist in the traditional sense, but he thinks outside the box, so to speak. He's not, I wouldn't place him in the category of the kind of stereotype that I mentioned earlier, but he does lean to the right. He's got a libertarian bent to it. I think you can get a pretty good feel for his personal philosophy from these guiding concepts that he puts on his website. The first one is debt is a cancer. It is killing our economy and killing the dreams of many Americans. There may be little you can do about the total national debt, but you can control your own debt. Do so now. So that expresses a sort of fiscal conservatism. The second one is protecting the environment is a good thing and it should be done. That said, climate change is not our most immediate danger. We are not all going to die from global warming. The evidence that carbon is the cause is thin at best. The biggest cause of the greenhouse effect is water vapor. Don't come here looking for activist environmentalism. You will be disappointed. Well, I don't know what the water vapor theory is. For all I know, that could be a valid point. I'm not a scientist, but I think this is an interesting position. He is not convinced about the human cause of global warming and climate change theory. He's not necessarily saying there is no such thing as climate change, but he is saying that he doesn't buy into the idea that human emissions, carbon emissions, have caused it. But he's still saying protect the environment is a good thing and it should be done. So the third point he makes is, in spite of our view expressed above, we are huge supporters of alternative energy such as wind and solar, primarily because they help to provide a more self-sufficiency and economic long-term stability. The danger of oil is its finite nature and inability to meet long-term global demand. So I think that the point there is, again, he doesn't buy into human-caused climate change, but as somebody who is interested in independence and self-sufficiency, it makes sense to get away from fuel sources that will come to an end and fuel sources that, to a certain extent, we have to buy from people in other countries. So he likes wind and solar because they are renewable and they don't rely upon having to buy them from other sources. The other 2 points just kind of give away his sense of humor and his particular character. He says, always be frugal, never be cheap. One protects your financial position, the other costs you more in the long run. On so many levels, that's true. And also, no matter what the sheep will tell you, what you do does matter, and you do control your own destiny. Live life to the fullest and understand that you have more control over your life than anyone or anything else. And so I think that's why Spirko is attracted to permaculture and why he came on the Permaculture podcast, is he likes the idea of independence in energy, but also independence correlating with that in food supply. In that interview, I remember him remarking that it was interesting how a certain type of latter-day hippie had a lot in common with people like himself, who kind of wanted to live off the land and be left alone and cooperate with people they wanted to cooperate with. Anyway, one of the reasons I included this is just to show you how people from different orientations can find something in common, political orientations. They can find something in common with each other in ways in which they can agree and cooperate with each other and find common ground. And I might mention at the end here that our urban farmer, Novella Carpenter, who was interviewed in her city setting with all of her goats and chickens and the pigs who went away after a while, is an example of a person like this in a different setting, who decided to, in the city, live a sort of homesteading life, become as independent as possible. She didn't seem to mind kind of being different and to a certain extent trying to interact with the people around her and create relationships with them and cooperative relationships with them when possible. She is an individual. And one thing that we can say about all these peoples is that they are individuals. They have decided that they're going to go their own way, live their life the way they see fit, and try to get people to accept that and maybe even to come along with them, but they're not going to be too concerned about conforming. Now, when some of these people may seem like oddballs to us, but this is precisely the type of person who, in a time of crisis, has solutions. They've got the personal strength based on being able to kind of live their own life regardless of the responses they may get from others. And they also have put in a lot of time figuring out how things work and thinking about how to adapt. And so those are the very people who can come in quite handy when things do break down, when new ideas are needed that can't be found from more traditional sources. And there's a lot of them in our society now who are not even particularly interested in regular politics and who would insist that they are engaging in political and social activity, but not in the traditional vein at all, not through voting, not through, get out the vote efforts, lobbying, trying to influence politicians, political contributions, all the things that still are very important parts of making change in a country like the United States. But these people see what they're doing as political activity as well. And if and when we need some sort of set of new ideas, these types of people are the people those new ideas are likely to come from. So this is part of the reason why we're exploring all of this in this class.